So we're going to start with step 5. Can the Fed normalize interest rates? Short answer, as you know, of course not. But we're going to hear from Jim himself, so let's go back to that Real Vision interview. You have to wonder why it is that real or inflation-adjusted yields on the 10-year Treasury in excess of, say, 3% seem to be such poison. What is that? Could it be that the leverage buildup, the debts buildup in the system along 10 years of very low central bank-sponsored nominal interest rates that have got us to the point of leverage that these higher rates we cannot stand these higher rates? So we know the Fed cannot normalize interest rates. And to be clear, if you look throughout American history, normal is about 5 to 6%. The last time the Fed tried to increase rates for a cycle, they couldn't even get to 3%. But why is that? Let me explain it to you using this simple example. You're right here and you want to make a good investment and you like real estate, so you think, well, I'll try to buy a hotel. And of course, you want to buy the Hotel California because it's just like 0% interest rates. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. So you go to the bank and you get a loan for $1 million to buy this Hotel California. To do that, you got to put down $100,000. So you got a loan of $900,000. With current interest rates being as low as they are, your annual payments to service this debt are $78,000. Let's say that the gross revenue from your Hotel California is $200,000. Your expenses are around $100,000. So then you have to less out your mortgage payment, which is $78,000. You're left with a profit of $22,000. You may say, well, that doesn't seem like a lot for a hotel. But look at your return. That's a 22% return. That is amazing in an environment where interest rates are this low. So you go ahead and pull the trigger. The problem is that interest rates on your loan adjust after 5 years. And if the interest rates normalize, in other words, they increase, let's say 5%, that takes your debt service payments from $78,000 a year to $108,000, an increase of $30,000, which would mean you'd go from making $22,000 a year to losing $8,000 a year. Now that you understand this simple example, we can extrapolate it throughout the entire economy. Government debt to GDP is at an all-time high. They're a subprime borrower. The majority of their debt is short-term, so it rolls over all the time. Consumer debt, with the exception of mortgages, corporate debt, state debt, all of these debts will roll over to a higher interest rate if rates normalize. In the same type of scenario that would play out with you and your Hotel California going from a profit to a loss would happen with our entire economy. Jim goes on to discuss normalizing rates. I would add myself that sometimes the Fed is not in charge of rates or events, but rather events and rates happen to the Fed. I, for one, have the belief that the Fed really is not in charge of things, especially at the long end of the yield curve. And I really love that. Sometimes the Fed isn't in charge of events, but events are in charge of the Fed. Going back to what he was saying about the yield curve, the Fed is presumed to have control of short rates because they're supposed to be able to easily control the Fed funds rate. That's the overnight rate. Although the long end of the yield curve at the 10-year and the 30-year is more controlled by market forces, buyers and sellers, the closer you get to that overnight rate, the closer the Fed should be in charge. But let's go back to September 17th. We all know what happened there in the repo market. The Fed was just moving right along, business as usual. The primary dealers and all the banks under the Fed's umbrella, they would lend to each other overnight at the Fed funds rate, which at the time, right around 2%. But the repo market just spiked way up to 10%. So a lot of the money that was going back and forth from bank A, B, and C started to go into the repo market because they wanted that higher return. Well, if there's liquidity going from these banks into the repo market, that means there's less liquidity for the interbank lending. That means that the Fed funds rate goes up to its higher limit. And if the Fed would not have come in and intervened in the repo market, they would have lost control of the Fed funds rate. It would have gone above their target. In other words, they would have lost control of the short end of the yield curve. That one thing that they are supposed to have total control over. Why is this important? Because global financial markets are heavily influenced by central banks. And there is no central bank that is more powerful than the Federal Reserve. So if the whole world is looking in and they see the Federal Reserve lose control, that means that all confidence in central banks would be gone. Step number 6, where will rates go in 2020? And on this topic, Jim gives us some incredible wisdom. I have humbly come to see just how much of the future is a great big surprise. And that is most of it. What we can observe is how people are positioned for the future. I infer by the state of things in the debt market that the world is basically of the view that inflation is not only dead, but also decomposing. In this state of being, it's safe to own long-dated bonds. In fact, they say one must own long-dated bonds yielding seemingly almost nothing, 2-3%. Some 100-year bonds yield not much more than 2%. I worry about that. One thing is indisputable. The rate of inflation is not itself a leading indicator of inflation. Sounds pretty straightforward, but if you dig a little bit deeper, there are some true nuggets of wisdom in what Jim is saying. Here's my takeaway. The market is comprised of individuals buying and selling on a daily basis, moving their money in and out. So this marketplace is only as perfect as the imperfect people who make up that marketplace. In other words, the market is highly inefficient because these people are emotional and irrational. I see this as a boat that can tip back and forth, and because the majority of the participants in the market are irrational, emotional, and make flat out bad decisions, if you get the majority on one side of the boat, that's usually the wrong side of the boat to be on. And that's why the market has the tendency to hurt the maximum amount of investors as possible. And right now we know that the majority of the people are on the never inflation side of the boat. Like Jim Grant says, they're thinking that inflation is dead. And we know this because a country like Argentina that's gone bust 8 times in its history can float a 100-year bond. Would you give your money to Argentina for 100 years? And by the way, editor, let's throw up a chart of that bond and see how the price is doing right now. Yeah, ouch, that really hurts, doesn't it? Or Austria can also float a 100-year bond at about 2%. This is a country that over the last 120 years has been at the center of 2 world wars. And you're going to give them your money for the next 100 years? But really, it's not about a bond. It's not about getting a return. The only reason that investors are going into a 100-year bond like Austria is because bonds have turned into stocks, meaning that because the Fed has artificially lowered these interest rates, people think that interest rates are going even further negative in Europe, and therefore that bond turns into an instrument where they're gambling on a capital return or a capital appreciation instead of buying that bond for an actual yield. So based on what the participants are doing in the market right now, we know that everyone is on this side of the boat. In fact, there's only one person on the inflation side of the boat, and he is holding an I heart gold sign. Who do you think that guy is? Of course, that's Peter Schiff. And there's a lot of recent examples of everybody being on the wrong side of the boat. Dot-com bubble, 1999, stocks will never go down. Housing, 2006, housing will never go down. Inflation in 2012, everyone thought that we would get inflation because of all the money printing. Nothing happened. As recently as 2018, the consensus is that we would have 4 rate hikes in 2019. And of course, what actually happened? The complete opposite. Jim then goes on to remind us that inflation in and of itself is not a leading indicator of future inflation. He uses the example in the early 60s. Editor, let's go ahead and pull up that data. The inflation rate in the early 60s was very low, but that told us nothing about the high inflation that we'd get between 1965 and 1980. In fact, if you held dollars between 1965 and 1980, you lost almost 60% of your purchasing power. So we know that most market participants are on the inflation is dead side of the boat. And typically, throughout history, that is a contrarian indicator. Will we see inflation or not? Only time will tell. But Jim also outlines some potential catalysts. What else might cause inflation? Oh yes, maybe a loss of confidence in the currency owing to excessive debt creation on the part of the national government. Might that be a source of inflation? Well, it has been in the past in some countries. Inflation, by definition, represents a loss of confidence in money. How do you lose confidence in money? Well, you create too much of it by subsidizing the spending habits of politicians. And I want to say that one more time for emphasis. How do you lose confidence in money? You create too much of it by subsidizing spending habits of the politicians. That's one possible cause, and are we on the way to doing something like that? And this is where Jim gets sarcastic. Well, possibly in this splendid economy where we're generating trillion-dollar budget deficits. We've all heard that excessive government debt can cause inflation. In other words, a loss of confidence in the currency. In the United States case, that would be the dollar. But how does that actually work? Right now, the US has $23 trillion in debt. Our budget deficit is over $1 trillion a year. So that's being added to this total. And keep in mind, this is at a time when we have the best economy in US history, according to Donald Trump's Twitter feed. Most of this debt is short-term, and on average, we pay about 2%. So $460 billion a year goes to pay just interest. But as you can see, the higher this number goes, the higher that number goes, and therefore the higher this number goes. We get into this government debt doom vortex. Where government debt expands, that increases the interest payments, which increase the government debt, which increase the interest payments even higher. It goes up and up and up and up. It's the infinity and beyond, the Buzz Lightyear government debt model. And we haven't even accounted for interest rates rising or going through a recession, which would blow this deficit out of the water. Editor, let's throw up a chart of what the US government debt was prior to the great financial crisis and what it is today. And you may be saying to yourself, yeah, George, I know, I get it. I've heard all that before. But look at Japan. They've got a debt to GDP of well over 200%, and they're still on the planet. Nothing's really happened to them. But I need to point out one major difference between Japan and the United States. There's a lot of them, and that requires its own specific video. But just from a 30,000 foot level, let's look at the savings rate with the population of Japan. The Japanese, on average, for the last 30 years, have saved 30% of their income. And at times, that's gone up to 40%. So if the total savings of the country is here, and the total debt of the country is here, regardless of how high that debt goes, the Japanese people have the ability to absorb more of it with the money that they save. I'm not saying that Japan won't blow up, and I'm not saying that this is good. What I am saying is that it's a lot different when we go over here to the United States, where our savings rate is way down here, but if our debt goes up to here, then the difference will have to be made up not by the savings rate of the general public in the US, but of foreigners. Why is that a big deal? Because foreigners' expenses aren't denominated in dollars. Therefore, they're going to be much more sensitive to inflation. The bottom line between these two, and again, this is just a very general example, is that on this side of the coin, interest rates would have the tendency to go much higher, inflation would have the tendency to go much higher, and confidence in the currency would go a lot lower. Jim points out that here in the United States, we like to consume a lot, but we don't really like to produce things. So we import all of this cheap stuff from down in Mexico, over here from China, and I'm sure I'm doing something politically incorrect here with green people and red people. But of course, on this channel, we don't care about stuff like that. So all these cheap goods come over into the United States. But what if we have a geopolitical event that would disrupt all of these supply chains? In other words, it would prevent us from getting all the cheap stuff that we as Americans love. Maybe that's a trade war with China, or a real war with Iran, if you check the news today. That's why, just on a side note, I always say you need to diversify your political risk. That's why I'm in Colombia right now. Notice it is not in the line of fire of China or Iran. Make a mental note of that. But moving on, because the United States doesn't have a lot of factories, it would take us a long time to build the infrastructure required to get all the consumer goods that we need. Also, the wages are so much higher here. To Jim's point, if we had to manufacture all of this stuff, the prices would go through the roof. And as you guys know from watching this channel, part of inflation, a big part of it, is the velocity of money, how fast it spins and moves throughout our economy from one person to the next person. And you may be saying, well, okay, what do we actually import? And would that actually increase velocity to the point where we'd have to worry about inflation? Editor, let's go ahead and pull up the top 10 importers to the United States. Walmart, Target, Lowe's, Home Depot, and the dollar stores. I'd like to ask you the question, if prices doubled, tripled, quadrupled at these stores, assuming that we could somehow produce these goods, which we can't, would this affect the average American? And you may be saying to yourself, George, yeah, I get it, but I mean, we produce a lot of things here in the United States, so I think we could kind of get by on our own. And to a certain extent, you may be right. We do produce a lot of food and cars in the United States. So we can always go over to Monsanto and get some GMO-infused corn that glows in the dark, or a $100,000 pickup truck from Ford. But I don't think that's going to solve all of our problems. I think we still go into this doom vortex of inflation, where higher consumer prices, because of these supply chains getting cut off, drives velocity higher, which increases interest rates, which means the Fed has to print more money. That just drives those consumer prices even higher. Step number 7, the moment you've all been waiting for. How does gold fit into this picture? Well, gold to me is an investment in monetary disorder. Inflation, I think, would spur people to reconsider gold, but so would severe deflation. Anything that cracks the facade of confidence, it's a real thing of confidence. And the judgment of our central bankers is a good thing. But I think gold is the reciprocal of the world's faith in the institution of central banking and the judgment of our central bankers. And for once, I have nothing to add. I can't say it any better than Jim Grant just did. If you don't have any confidence in the central banks or central bankers, you got to own some gold. For more content like this in part 1 of this video, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.